Good morning. We're starting our quite short panel on Donbas, whether there's an option of a frozen conflict. My name is Angelina Karyakina. I'm editor-in-chief of Hromadske UA. It's a multimedia platform, independent multimedia platform in Ukraine. You could probably hear about us during Maidan protests. We were streaming online all the time. Now our role is a bit shifting, but this panel is obviously not only about us, and it's more about Ukraine, Donbas, and the prospects of solution of the conflict. I'd like to welcome our panelists and to present Oleg Rybachuk, who is the head of the Center UA NGO, a former deputy prime minister on integration and a former head of presidential secretariat during Viktor Yushchenko times, and Arkady Moshes, the program director of Finnish Institute for International Affairs. Welcome. As we start our talk about frozen conflict, it really seems to be quite weird talking about frozen conflict, as just 2 days ago there were reported shellings in Makiyivka, and two civilians were reportedly killed, and there are daily reports about people, civilians, and also military, Ukrainian military killed at the front lines. So it doesn't seem to be a frozen conflict at all, even though there is no, huge shellings or attacks or fightings over the front line. Still, it's something that is there on a daily basis, and firings and shellings. It's been less than 2 weeks since the Normandy talks in Berlin. I'd like to remind that Ukraine's president, and then later also Chancellor Merkel and other leaders that were taking part in these talks, went out with a message saying that there should be a roadmap to Minsk very soon, actually by the end of November. So in that framework, I would like to start our talk about Minsk agreement as a roadmap as the only formal, let's say, a roadmap to the solution of this conflict. What does it envisage? Oleg, in your opinion, what kind of solution does Minsk suggest overall?
Well, today's session in Riga Security Forum opened with discussions of cooperative peace or back to diplomacy, and there they mentioned that in Helsinki Act, actually, which brought sustainable peace to Europe after World War II, it was based on structured defense, structured security. Sides understood that there is a danger, but they agreed on certain rules. And what happened in my country, what happened in Ukraine 2 years ago, is just total violation of all these rules. I have to remind all of us that Crimea, part of Ukraine, was occupied and then annexed by Russia, and it must not be forgiven. And Minsk agreement, which we are discussing today, is supposed to somehow deal with, again, occupied parts of Ukrainian East Donetsk and Luhansk region. For my humble opinion, Minsk agreement does not provide any final solution, neither for Ukraine nor for Russia. Ukraine wants to see its territory sovereign and independent. Again, Russia would like to impose on Ukraine a blocking package where with puppet regimes, which Russia hopes to install in those areas, and by changing Ukrainian constitution, Russia would like to stop any EU related integration of Ukraine, and also Minsk agreement doesn't allow this to do so. I believe that Minsk agreement is not an answer to permanent solution, but as everyone agrees, it has decreased to some extent violence.
Arkady, in your opinion, what does it suggest?
Well, first of all, we have to give the Minsk agreement, especially the first Minsk agreement, its due. It helped to save people's lives. I think without Minsk, the situation could have been worse. The problem with Minsk, however, is that it actually, as every probably agreement that is signed under such circumstances, under duress, under stress, negotiated hastily, I agree that, first of all, it doesn't give the perspective of how things can be done. But what's most important, its philosophy was creating another frozen conflict. You freeze the situation now, and then you see what's going to happen. Maybe things will be solved. And that's a mistake. When we're now talking about the next roadmap, maybe we should go a little bit back and see that there is no such thing as Minsk II. There is no agreement called Minsk II. There is a package, a complex of measures aimed at implementing Minsk I. There's only one Minsk agreement, but the problem...
That's a roadmap to Minsk
Well,
I,
this was the roadmap, but it was not the roadmap to Minsk I, because when you read it, then a lot of things which are envisaged by Minsk II actually openly contradicts Minsk I. So we are dealing with a very complicated and internally contradictory set of agreements, aimed at basically freezing the situation, arriving, kind of establishing a new status quo, and then working within that context. But it's simply not possible, and that's why that's one of the explanations why the agreement has failed so far.
So how many roadmaps do you think we might need if you say that Minsk II is basically could have been or should have been a roadmap to Minsk I, and now there's probably another roadmap map coming, even though there are talks and reports that there is no actually success in that direction, at least on the level of ministers of foreign affairs. How many roadmaps more, and what is the basic problem? Why do we need a roadmap to Minsk?
Well, we need a roadmap in order to establish and register at least some progress. We cannot be talking about any progress if 2 years after Minsk I and more in the year after Minsk II, we are still seeing the fighting, and people are dying almost every day. So that's why we need at least some hope to have progress, and in that sense I understand. But for as long as strategic goals of the sides involved are, as Oleg has just said, are so irreconcilable, frankly, I don't see how much we can move forward. It's good to have the diplomatic process going on. It's good that the Normandy format, which was declared dead by Moscow in August, and now we see that it's not dead. I mean, the diplomatic process continues, but it doesn't help to resolve the problems on the ground, because strategic goals are still very far from each other. Because, as we know, Moscow wants to re-establish control over all of Ukraine using this conflict. The others understand it. So this is not going to happen, and first of all, Kiev understands it. But also I can say that we are losing time, because I think today any serious conversation about reintegration of people who still reside in the separatist enclaves in Ukraine into the main body of Ukrainian sovereign state, it's much more difficult than it was 2 years ago, simply because they've got a different life experience. It was easy to reintegrate those towns that returned under Ukrainian control in summer 2014. Because these people realized that compared with war, compared the complete disorder that they had been experiencing throughout those summer months, to have a government back, a government which pays pensions and opens schools, it's something that they should welcome, even if though not necessarily fully like. But we've lost 2 more years, and with a lot more hardship and suffering, on the separatist side, they will definitely keep blaming Ukraine for all the problems that they've been having. And on the Ukrainian side, the readiness to work in order to, I would say, socially rehabilitate these people is going down. Ukraine is talking about full reintegration of territories, but not necessarily people, and definitely not about reintegration of republics. And that's going to be another problem. So in that sense, now 2 years since the start of the process, we are probably even further away from reintegration than we were.
But indeed, sometimes there are moments that it looks like neither of the sides were going to stick, let's say, to the agreement. Oleg, but in your opinion, is there a strategy in Ukraine to how reintegrate, as Arkady is saying, not the republics, but the people of Donbas, people in eastern Ukraine?
Well, strategy is not the strongest side of Ukrainian government. We simply do not have this tradition we do not produce policies, and we are very often acting ad hoc. But here I would like to emphasize again that what happened in 21st century in the center of Europe with Ukraine has undermined the whole security, global security system, and Helsinki Act agreement, which was a major achievement of post-war Europe, which allowed Europe, being the continent where two world wars started, being peaceful a few decades after that. Now and today, again, it was emphasized by the panel speakers in the morning that all written rules or unwritten rules are simply not honored. Therefore, if there is nothing to honor, if the whole basic system of trust or structured security is violated, to come back to peace in Ukraine, or to come back to the fact that territories are not to be violated, other parts of the countries are not to be annexed in 21st century, it is very challenging. So while we discuss informal consultations, Minsk is difficult to call any international treaty because, well, there are no signatures. Ukrainian parliament, which as per our constitution is the body to authorize and to approve such deals, was not involved in the process. It means that we have a situation where the fundamental rules are broken. What is going on is quite often informal, and we have a partner which doesn't recognize or doesn't respect international law. What about informal agreement? There is no choice. Practically, what makes things still as they are is not even the fact that there was Minsk agreement signed. I would like to remind all of us that probably Putin, who initiated or who invaded Ukraine, he was not counting on that severe resistance which he has met in eastern Ukraine. He probably was hoping to get scenario similar to Crimea. Mm-hmm. And the fact that Ukrainian people, Russian-speaking Ukrainian people, were not simply prepared, but they went and they formed practically new Ukrainian army, and Russian army which invaded Ukraine initially have heavily losses. Probably this led to today's status where Putin, for a number of reasons, cannot move in regular arms because that would lead to counter strikes, and Ukraine is not strong enough to liberate its own territory. So we have this shaking status of you may call it frozen conflict, because it's not expanded, but it's not also leading to any perspective from territorial integrity or peace of Ukrainian state.
Yes, but talking about, let's say, fighting for people's minds, yes, and talking about Ukraine's strategy, which you say is pretty hard to sit down and make a plan for that. Is there a possibility, is there an experience, probably an international experience Ukraine could take a look at while having this kind of a conflict, but still keep on doing things, not only calling on international community to help and with weapons, to help with diplomacy, but also to be proactive about that? I'd like both panelists to comment on that.
I would very briefly comment. Yes, there is a practically majority of Ukrainian experts or public opinion believes that there is a way, and this way is to make Ukrainian army strong enough to defend its own territory, to make Ukrainian country or Ukrainian state attractive, successful economically, with much better functioning social system, with reforms taking on, with corruption with conditions for small and medium businesses created. So in short, to make Ukraine an attractive democracy is the way for the future, for Crimea or for occupied territories of Donetsk or Luhansk being attractive, much more attractive than they are now. Also, from logical point of view, I believe that that part of Donetsk and Luhansk which is occupied by Russian troops must be legally called occupied territories, because it is. Russia, which has occupied those territories, must be called occupant, because by international law the aggressor has its own responsibilities. Then we also must, and that should be part of the strategy, and then we also should prepare and should create conditions for those Ukrainians living on those occupied territory to move to Ukrainian part of, and to have certain rights guaranteed. If this doesn't happen, and if we call what is their anti-terrorist operations, it is very misleading from international point of view, and that would allow Putin to say, after all, that he has no responsibility, that there are Ukrainians fighting Ukrainians. All the world knows it is not the truth, but my government, for some reasons, doesn't follow this logic, and I don't understand why we pretend that we can have elections in occupied territories.
Arkady, what would you have to say?
I basically agree. I mean, I don't have much to add. I just want also to emphasize that the way forward is through reforms in Ukraine, through building a functional state, through anchoring Ukraine more firmly, through a value-based platform into the system of essentially Western values. Among other things, it will also, if that happens, which unfortunately is not guaranteed, that will send also a signal to Moscow that maintaining tension in the east of Ukraine is not going to be instrumentally helpful in controlling Ukraine either, because you can control Donetsk, but that's not going to help you control Kiev. And then sooner or later some people might realize that also Moscow tactics will have to be changed.
Talking about Moscow tactics, in December 2014 you had a report on how sustainable is separatism in eastern Ukraine. You were actually saying that you were comparing that situation to Transnistria and arguing that Russia cannot, let's say, get the same political results, so to say, in this situation. Why?
Well, thank you for bringing back the issue. As a researcher, as an analyst, I should be very proud of that publication, together with my co-author Andras Schratz, because we were able to more or less accurately predict a number of things. One of them being that this was and would be a totally new type of an armed conflict in the post-Soviet space, and that conflict would not be frozen. But of course, as a human being, I certainly I'm not happy. I regret that our predictions came true. Among other things, we actually predicted an escalation which de facto happened in January, February 2015. And it was indeed the main point, to try to bring the attention, to draw the attention to what we thought was important. This conflict was by far kind of too big as compared with everything else that had been happening in the post-Soviet space before then. And we were arguing that this conflict would not be possible to freeze, and if people are serious, they would have to, from day one, thinking about its resolution. We were all arguing, perhaps contradictory and paradoxically a bit, we were arguing that resolution was possible and would be possible. Now it's more difficult to argue that, because of the dynamics and of the windows of opportunities and the chances that have been wasted by the West, I would say, primarily. Why we thought that, well, first of all, because yes, it was too big by the number of by the mere scale of it, it was much bigger. We were talking about millions of people, much larger territories. But we were also talking about the antagonism that already by then had emerged between Russia and the West around that conflict, because in all other conflicts, Russia was able to be treated from day one as a part of the mediation process, as a part of the solution, and not as a part of the problem. Whether people believed it or not, it's another matter. But it was obvious that at that moment Russia was already under sanctions, and it put forward reciprocal sanctions. So this was already a direct conflict between Russia and the West, of which the conflict in the east of Ukraine was a driving factor, a symptom, one component, but not the only reason. And it was the unwillingness and hesitance of the West to call a spade, and it was the willingness of the West to invent some kind of diplomatic formula to describe Russian involvement that became misleading, that became a factor distorting the whole picture. So it was too big objectively, that conflict, because it was a very big, high-intensity military conflict lasting for months by that moment. It was already a direct conflict between Russia and the West. And in that sense, as I said, it was very difficult to freeze. But meanwhile, it was also too small against the set of goals which was envisioned by Moscow in the very beginning. Compared with the Novorossiya project, the 3% of the Ukrainian constitutional territory that separatists control is way too small. The remaining population, which was very difficult to estimate back then, and it is also difficult to estimate now, but it's probably 1.5 million people which may still reside on the territories.
To control Kiev, you're saying, right? To control Kiev. By controlling the instrumentally, this is too small. I mean, I will say something which it's not politically correct, but let me put it that way: without these territories, geopolitically, Ukraine remains Ukraine. It's painful, even if these territories are lost. Well, I'd agree that
Ukraine remains a big geopolitical player, a big territory, and on a daily basis. I mean, it doesn't matter how much, whether in that sense, what I'm trying to put, it doesn't matter whether Ukraine is a member of NATO or not. It matters that NATO is in Ukraine de facto, through cooperation, through all sorts of forms of engagement, and this is what Ukraine's sovereign choice is. Its sovereign choice is, at the moment, go west in the security sense of the word. And whether Russia controls territories of DNR and LNR or not, it does not have an instrument to stop that.
Yeah, but it brings also this whole instrumentarium for inner manipulation inside Ukraine, saying that we could do that without Donbas. Why should we care? And there's a lot of manipulation about that, and it's quite dangerous for Ukrainian sovereignty to say so. Don't you think so?
That's why I said that. I mean, what I'm giving you an analysis. The point is, of course, I mean, no country should be willing to negotiate the loss of its territory. I mean, this is absolutely clear. And of course, you have the argument about the memory of the dead, and you have all sorts of arguments. I'm not trying to say that Ukraine should now make an initiative about recognizing the front line as a new state border of Ukraine. I'm saying that in the situation as it is now, meaning Kiev does not control these territories, Ukraine remains a geopolitical Ukraine.
Yeah, we are sitting in Riga, one of Baltic countries occupied by Soviet army at the beginning of World War II. The world never recognized this part of territories, Baltic countries, as Soviet Union. And a few decades passed, we now have very independent, very prominent and successfully functioning states in Baltic countries. Therefore, for me, it is absolutely clear that yes, Crimea is occupied and annexed. Part of Donetsk and Luhansk areas are occupied and annexed. But I fully agree again what Arkady says, and I strongly believe into the fact that Ukraine must become very successful sovereign reform reformed, with low corruption, good climate for business state, and then it's issue of time when we'll get our territories back. I don't see any other effective strategy. If we fail to become a part of European Union by the way we function, by our economic and democratic values, there is very little perspective for Ukraine to be what we try to be independent and sovereign democracy. Therefore, our strategy should be very simple. We recognize those territories are occupied. We do maximum to defend our citizens there using international law, as we now do with Crimean Tatars or with human rights on occupied territories, Donetsk and Luhansk. So we use international law instruments, but the most important thing is we make Ukraine attractive for all Ukrainians, and then it's issue of time when we'll get our territory back.
It's a pity we don't have much time to also talk about how Ukraine could do more for those people in Donbas, because it's a huge problem, and the humanitarian aspect of this conflict is really huge, and I think sometimes it's really off the agenda of the public discussion in Ukraine as well. It's a huge problem to bring it to this whole discussion of how we bring a solution to that conflict. But talking about borders, I would like to probably ask the last question on this panel about international involvement into this conflict, and in particular about the role of the OSCE. And the ongoing discussion about the possibility of involving an armed police mission. Do you think it's time for us to reconsider the role of international organizations, security organizations such as the OSCE, Arkady?
Well, I don't quite understand what you mean by reconsidering.
By OSCE could be armed.
Yes.
Well, it's going to be an endless discussion.
International
I mean, we don't have a precedent of an armed OSCE mission.
This is why I'm asking if we're ready to reconsider.
We don't
the
know
role.
what the members, almost 60 states, can agree to write down into its mandate. One story is that if these people are given pistols so that they would be able to protect themselves from pocket thieves. We are not, I'm sure that we are fortunately or unfortunately not going towards anything even resembling the UN peacekeeping. And I'm afraid that even UN peacekeeping, with all its experience, has a very mixed record. And we unfortunately know what happened in Srebrenica. And we know lots of things. So it's a long, difficult story. It's maybe better to have more instruments of control than less. But at this point, it would be much more, I think, more promising to agree and demand the unrestricted access of the OSCE monitors to all the areas to which they do not have access still.
So next day, after Putin formally welcomed the idea in Berlin, his puppets in occupied parts of Donetsk and Luhansk screamed like a hell, no, we will not tolerate, we will not allow. And this is a bad joke, because we all understand that there are no separatist governments there. There are just marionettes or puppets of Moscow, so Moscow would play this game. It's clear that Putin would not agree, because a full functioning, independent and armed policing would seal the border, and that would not allow conflict to go on. Therefore, I don't see perspective in this idea.
Thank you so much. I'd like to thank our panelists, Oleg Rybachuk and Arkady Mushets, myself, and Irina Karyakina, Hromadske UA. Thank you so much for listening to us, and probably see you elsewhere and continue the discussion about Donbas and about the conflict in eastern Ukraine.